There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It's Tuesday again. Come on in. Wasn't that over the rainbow great? Last time I told you we were going to go to Liverpool, but with the sad news from Saturday about little Richard flying away, thought I would change gears just a little bit and talk about him and the influence that he was on the Beatles and everything in this room and so many of our lives for sure. Richard's, was very influential in the pre-fame days of the Beatles. They played his songs at the Star Club. They recorded his songs on their early records. He was "Long Tall Sally" was the last live song that the Beatles played, and then "Long Tall Sally" was also the last song that Paul played on the solo tour when he came back to Candlestick Park a few years ago. They recorded their songs in the solo years. And if you haven't played these lately, these singles sound excellent. I just put those on the turntable not too long today, actually, and those sound great. And influence all the way up through the career, as recently as this "Good Golly Miss Molly" that went with the King Ralph movie. Jeff Lynne produced this, and Ringo is on drums on this version of "Good Golly Miss Molly," Little Richard, and a John Goodman version as well. Got Little Richard. I was lucky enough to meet Little Richard a few times and ask him to sign that photo that I'd taken. I believe I took that at the Macon Opry House in his hometown in Macon, Georgia. In fact, on the way into that concert, I asked him for a photo with him as well, and he goes, "Not right now, baby." And the fact that Little Richard called me baby, that's a thrill for sure. He signed several other items for me over the years. I got to see him live and meet him a few times. He always had a red pen with him that was a little bit flat or a little bit out of ink, but that's him signing that. He had also signed a book that I've used as an autograph book in some ways. This Mercy Beat book had a full page ad of where the Beatles opened for Little Richard way many years ago, and Little Richard signed that for me, as well as Billy J. Kramer. Richard signed the album called "The King of Rock and Roll" for me there. I was doing a photo pass that night. He also signed at one point my Rock and Roll Hall of Fame program, where he was inducted to the Hall of Fame. Glad the pen looked sharp enough and dense enough on that one. But the story shifts at this point with this magazine, because now we move from the Little Richard type stories, but into the year 1999. And I was in New York City. Paul McCartney was doing the Charlie Rose show the next night to promote his Blackbird singing book that had just been released. And the Iridium Club in New York City was owned by Les Paul, and on Mondays, Les played there himself. And anytime I was in New York on Mondays, I always tried to go to Les Paul Club to see Les Paul play, and he was always so much fun, so entertaining. I always tried to get that front table that was right down at his feet, literally, because he would usually end up giving you the finger, or at least playing with the audience a lot. And this night, when we went to take our seats, that particular table, my table, had been reserved that night. So we sat behind that table, and they seat you there with 6 or so at a table, and sitting with a stranger. The guy across the table asked me why I was there that night, and I explained to him that I was there to see Paul in that promotional event next night. And I said jokingly to the fellow across the table, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that table right there was reserved for Sir Paul himself. And he looked over my head and kind of went a little white and said, "Looks like you called that one, mate." And about that time, my chair got kicked, and Paul McCartney put his face right down here and says, "Oh, sorry, mate, we're just getting to our seat." And at that point, I think he recognized me as a fan and kind of nodded, but he and his party sat right in front of us, just between us and Les Paul all night. At the end of the, at one point though, Paul did get up, Les Paul called Paul McCartney up on stage, and they did about 2 or 3 minutes of shtick. There was one funny bit where Paul apologized for never paying Les any royalties for using his songs back in the early days, and handed Les a $1 bill, and Les just cracked up. It was a great expression on his face. In fact, all this is on that whole 3-minute segment's on YouTube. I'll put that a link to that under the video when we get finished here. But at the end of Les Paul's set, Les said that he was going to go backstage and towel off, but he was sure that Paul wouldn't mind signing a few autographs while the fans waited on Les Paul to come out. Paul flinched a little bit, but a few people, actually I was surprised, the majority of the people just left the club after Les had finished his set, but a few of us hung around there and sat and talked, sat and got some autographs from Paul. And I handed him, I had this with me as well, and handed him this, and he started looking through it and said, what's somebody's already written on that or something like that. And I told him that was Phil Everly, and as he was going through the book, I pointed out Don Everly, Mary from the Supremes, a couple of the Beach Boys, Al and the Douchebag. Benny King has signed this for me. Bobby Blue Bland, Dion had signed it. Les eventually signed it later that night, I believe. All about the Star Club history. This is where Little Richard had signed it earlier. Some others that had signed it included Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, and B.B. King, as well as Paul Schaefer and Sid, Will, and Anton from the house band or the David Letterman band as well. So as I handed it back to Paul for him to sign it, as I handed it to him, he was going through the book. When he got to the picture of Little Richard, Paul goes, "Richard, I taught him everything he knows." And everyone around me just kind of cracked up a little bit, because we wasn't really sure whether Paul was saying that he taught Little Richard everything he knows, or Paul was just acknowledging the fact that Little Richard had indeed taught him everything he knows, and Richard was always quick to tell you that as well. And that became an even more special souvenir of that night. And great part about it was just about the time Paul said something like, "Richard, I taught him everything he knows," a camera flash went off, and I asked the guy if I could get a copy of that picture, and that was in the days too. Now this was film camera, no digital immediate check-in page, so it was about 3, 4, maybe 5 days later. I remember walking into the film store that had the picture processed, and the little girl behind the counter had this sad look on her face. She says, "Oh, Rick, none of those pictures came out." And I said, "None of them at all?" And she said, "None of them except this one." And she showed me this picture of Paul McCartney and myself at that moment. And I was so glad. And I said, "Actually, make me a 8x10 of that one." She says, "I've already got one in the works." And got a nice souvenir of that moment for meeting Paul. And with Little Richard to corkscrew into that story as well. So thought give Little Richard a special send-off here, and thank him for the influence and all the joy that he brought. You talk about a personality that brought life into the room, the life into the music, and we owe Little Richard quite a debt for being such a key piece of the puzzle in this great picture that we've been living through here. Next time we will go to Liverpool, and I'll get back to the story of the memorabilia that I was going to tell you about this time. Peace and love, confidence in science. See you next time.